Pacific Week, and these two shows, they are truly about the island hopping campaign. The one about Burma technically isn't really part of the Pacific, but you kind of get the drift. If you are new to this channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to consider becoming either a patron or YouTube channel member, and all the information you need is in the description on the YouTube page below. So merchandise links, links to my guests' websites and books and publications, and social media links, etc., etc. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in my guest today, and JD Hewitt of the amazing History Underground YouTube channel, which, if you haven't seen, where the hell have you been? Way more popular than me, massive reach, covers all sorts of eras, American Revolutionary Wars, Civil War, World War II, other interesting bits of history, does some stuff, great work with Eric Dorr at the Gettysburg Museum of History. But he's on here today to talk about his fairly recent trips to Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, and just what it's like visiting those areas. I was privileged to be with JD on his kind of second time to Normandy and third time to Normandy, and you kind of seeing someone's reaction to seeing battlefields for the first time. And so I'm really keen to bring him in and find out what he thought about walking through these incredible places that are so important in history. So I'm going to bring JD in now. So how are you today, JD?
Doing well. Yep, doing well. How about you?
I'm very well. So, you know, you've since you started your channel, you know, you started off kind of close to home, and it was around your part of the USA. Then you started going a bit further afield. Then suddenly it was Normandy, and then the Ardennes, and now island hopping. So, how did it come about, your trip over there? Obviously, you're filming content for the channel, but was it kind of a long time in the planning?
Yeah. As far as planning goes, I mean, logistically, you know, trying to get over to anywhere in the Pacific is probably has taken more planning and has been more involved than anything else I've ever done. And you mentioned that, you know, I've been to Normandy, I've been to the Ardennes and places like that. And the most consistent reoccurring question that I kept getting was, when are you going to the Pacific? When are you going here? Because, you know, you have a lot of people who are watching and they say, you know, my dad was you know, at Iwo Jima, or my great grandpa was at Guadalcanal, or something like that. So, I mean, it's always been a personal goal of mine to go to some of those places. And then, you know, finally had the opportunity. Originally, I'm a very linear thinker. So I like to start at the beginning and go forward if I can. So what I wanted to do was go to Pearl Harbor. And then I wanted to go to Guadalcanal. I had emailed, messaged back and forth with David Holland a little bit, and we were going to try and link up. But Guadalcanal, I think it's still closed to tourists.
Yeah.
So Saipan, Guam, Tinian, they're American territories. So it makes it, you know, a little bit easier in that regard to go there. So that's, yeah, where I ended up landing.
You didn't do it chronologically in the end, but I mean, and this is the thing,
yeah.
isn't it? Pacific theater is that when we're talking about the European theater, you know, cities built around rivers with bridges and cathedrals, you know, it's a bit like American cities, a bit like British cities. There's a sense of understanding of what that terrain is. If you're sitting in Chicago or you know, Coventry, England, and you're reading about a city in Germany, you kind of, it ballpark is similar to the city you live in yourself. But the Pacific, you know, volcanic islands and jungle and all those features that to us are kind of fantastical. That's, you know, when we're growing up in Essex, as I did, there's not much jungle near me, not much volcanic sand, and so, you know, we'll bring up your PowerPoint and you'll take us through your journey, and we've got some video clips we'll show as well, and of course, eventually you'll be putting all this content on your own channel in your own little 15-20 minute fantastic dives into history. But we'll bring up the PowerPoint, and folks, if you have questions for JD, then just please throw them his way. But it's more about the general experience of visiting these places rather than a deep dive on the specifics of the history of these locations. JD will know some of the stuff, but, you know, neither of us are going to be micro-analyzing exactly which engineer battalion built which airfield there and which squadrons fighter. That we'll leave to the proper historians. Oh, you are a proper historian. So anyway,
no, you were correct with that first statement.
You do it professionally. Well, I suppose the same way, I suppose. Yeah, but
I see myself. I think I have a I'm in. And I'm, you have a lot of people on the show who are, I'm regular viewers. So, I know the caliber of guests that you have and people who really know their stuff. I consider myself more of a camera monkey. So, you can have the professionals and the people who are really, taking deep dives into the stuff that talk about, the minutia. And then you can go to my channel and you can see what it looks like. And yeah, so anyway, I'll try and answer any questions the best I can. But anyway, yeah, so Operation Forager, looking at the fight for Saipan and Guam and Tinian. So during World War II, you have a lot of guys, you really kind of touched on it, guys from the Midwest or from New York City or something like that. A lot of people, they'll recognize places like Paris, or Brussels, any of those big European areas, they might have had some familiarity with. Whenever they started talking about the Pacific, like even FDR, he would encourage people, get out a map, so that you can kind of follow along and see where we are, because the Pacific is such a vast place, and it's really literally a foreign to most Americans. So the Mariana Islands is just this little chain of islands between Australia and Japan. You can see it there on the map, and then there on the right, kind of zoomed in a little bit. And then at this period in history, Guam was a territory of the United States that they acquired after the Spanish-American War in 1898. And then the other large islands in the Mariana Island chain would be Saipan, Rota, Tinian. Okay, and those were occupied by the Japanese at the time. So, I mean, whenever you're talking about the war in the Pacific and Operation Forager, you can't talk about any of that without talking about Teddy Roosevelt. So if you go back to 1904, 1905, you have the Russo-Japanese War, and Teddy Roosevelt is quite well known for getting the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the peace between Russia and Japan. Whenever that war started, people thought that Russia was just going to roll right over the Japanese, and it ended up not being that way. And Teddy Roosevelt was a little bit concerned that there might be a balance of power that was shifting towards the Japanese, and he wanted to try and stave that off. So he mediates this peace. But in 1908, he wrote a letter to a friend who was in Hawaii. And it's really quite remarkable that here 30 years before the war starts, he says sooner or later the Japanese will try and bolster up their power by another war. Unfortunately for us, we have what they want most, the Philippines. When it comes, we will win over Japan, but it will be one of the most disastrous conflicts that the world has ever seen. Of course, he's referring to the Philippines, which was also a territory of the United States that we had gained from Spain in the Spanish-American War. So shifting forward, just to kind of give some context into Operation Forager and why the Mariana Island chain was important in World War II. If you look at Japan in World War I, prior to World War I, there was an Anglo-Japanese alliance that had been formed in 1902. I think it was renewed in 1912, if I remember right. And then, of course, World War I starts August 4th of 1914. The British declare war on Germany. August 12th, they declare war on Austria-Hungary. And then on August 23rd, Japan declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. And, whenever we're talking about World War I, the focus is always on the Western Front, maybe a little bit on the Eastern Front. You don't hear anything really about the conflict in the Pacific. But there is a little bit that takes place there. So the Japanese ended up capturing the German concession at Tsingtao, which is kind of in the northern part of China, right there on the coast, was a port city. And then from there, they go down and they start just occupying these German colonies. Germany, of course, was not concerned as much with their holdings in the Pacific at that time. So with the exception of Guam, the Mariana Islands are occupied by the Japanese. The Marshall Islands are occupied by the Japanese. The Caroline Islands are occupied by the Japanese. And then they ended up moving out even further and securing those sea lanes. Something that's kind of interesting for people who are like enthusiasts about naval aviation history. That ship that you see right there is called the Wakayama. This was a Japanese ship that had been converted to an aircraft carrier. And in World War I, in the Battle of Tsingtao, this is going to be the very first naval air raid in military history. So the Japanese, kind of have this deep history going into World War II with naval aviation and with operating off of carriers and things like that. Okay, so after World War I, the United States kind of realizes that they had been caught flat-footed going into the war. And they start developing all of what are these color-coded war plans so that they don't get caught off guard ever again. So this was a series of war plans from what was called the U.S. Joint Army and Navy Board. This was a predecessor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it goes through several different revisions. War Plan Orange was addressing a possible war with Japan. Okay, so we still had the Philippines at this point in history. So the assumption was that if a war broke out with Japan, the Japanese would blockade the Philippines. And everybody's still operating off of the war philosophy of Mahan. Mahan was, a big proponent of naval warfare and was always kind of talking about how wars in the future were going to be decided by these decisive naval battles. So the assumption was that if there is a war with Japan, it's going to be largely naval in its character, unless we're going to need ground forces, to isolate, these areas in the West Pacific and basically cut off Japan from any resources. So key elements of War Plan Orange is that the Philippines would have to hold out until the U.S. could get there. The U.S. fleet would move west from Hawaii and start taking these Japanese mandates in the Caroline and Marshall Islands. Once they establish a line with the Philippines, they can establish a base of operations there and then move north on Japan. So here you can see a map. This is from July of 1934 from War Plan Orange, where they were kind of gaming out what a possible conflict with Japan might look like. And let me go back to, hang on a second. Let me go back to this slide right here. Right. No, it's not the one I wanted. All right, anyway, maybe I'll hit it again here in a second. Anyway, whenever they were discussing War Plan Orange, the Mariana Islands set a little bit north of that main line. So there was always some debate on what to do with the Mariana Islands. Are they included in this war plan? Do we just bypass them and get straight to the Philippines and then relieve Guam? So anyway, going into that. Oh, by the way, there were all kinds of, like I said, color-coded war plans. One thing that I found really interesting, there was another one called War Plan Red, where the U.S. was gaming out a possible war with Britain if it ever broke out. Oh. Yeah. So I guess in case you all, decided that you wanted to come back and burn down our White House again, there was a plan in place for.
Well, it's good to know. I will call Her Majesty and make sure she's aware in case she's thinking about it. But when you talk about these plans, we've talked about, another Drakenif and other people have talked about it, is the 20s and 30s all the empires are thinking about various things happening in this part of the world. The British are kind of gradually conceiving the Singapore plan. There's all, the Japanese themselves are plan. It's a real area of theoretical studies, but the issue kind of comes is that they're studies made in the 20s and 30s with the tech and the equipment available in the 20s and 30s. And when World War II comes around, although the places are exactly in the same locations they've always been, the tech about getting between them and everything and the nature of war has changed on. So they're kind of valuable and not valuable at the same time, these studies. They're kind of up to date but outdated. It's a paradox.
Well, yeah, and in one way that it was valuable, there was another plan called War Plan Red Orange or Orange Red, where the U.S. was gaming out, okay, what do we do if there's an alliance between Britain and Japan, and we have to fight both of them at the same time? So whenever World War II rolls around, obviously it's not Britain that we're fighting, but it is Germany, and we're having to fight that two-front war. So the thought had already been in place on what to do if we have to fight, towards the Atlantic and towards the Pacific. So as Germany is ramping up its war machine in Europe, and the Japanese are practicing military expansion in the Pacific. The war plans get updated into what were called the Rainbow plans. So Rainbow 1 was the plan where if the U.S. had to fight a defensive war north of the 10-degree line of latitude, so that's North America. The 10-degree line of latitude is around like the southern border of Mexico.
Right.
What do we do if we have no allies? Okay, so that's Rainbow 1. Rainbow 2 is the same as Rainbow 1, but we have France and Britain as allies. Rainbow 3 is we secure the hemisphere and then proceed on with War Plan Orange. Rainbow 4 is same as Rainbow 1, but it includes a defense of the entire Western Hemisphere instead of just North America. Rainbow 5 is really kind of the plan that we end up moving forward with. This is an offensive operation in Europe and Africa, along with the French and the British. Here's something that's kind of interesting about Rainbow 5. This war plan was leaked to the Chicago Tribune 3 days before Pearl Harbor. There was this huge uproar whenever this plan got leaked, because the U.S. is supposed to be isolationist, and we're supposed to be staying out of this war. And all of a sudden, it's discovered that, well, here are these war plans that the U.S. has been devising. So there was a lot of heat over that, and then of course, you have December 7th, just a few days later, and all that kind of goes away. And there's different theories about how that got leaked. Some people say it was an isolationist person who was on the inside who leaked it, and then there are some who say that it was FDR himself that was responsible for the leak. But anyway, these war plans are super interesting to go through, and if I had more time, I would spend a lot more time reading through them. But one of these days, whenever my life slows down a little bit, I'm gonna dive into them.
Depends on when that may be, but yeah, it's sometime distant.
Yeah. So early in 1941, one of the biggest misconceptions is that Pearl Harbor happens and the U.S. is completely taken off guard, and everything like that, which in to a degree were. There were some thoughts about this very early on. So early in 41, the British and the U.S. were meeting together, kind of discussing a strategy, like, okay, what happens if the U.S. gets involved in this thing? And early in 41, before the U.S. is even involved, they agree that there's going to be a Germany first policy if the U.S. does become involved in the war, and that the Pacific conflict is going to have to remain defensive in its nature. So the War Plan Orange gets altered a little bit because it had assumed that the U.S. was going to be doing everything by themselves. Well, now that it's assumed that the British are going to be allies, it gets updated to where, okay, we're going to have to hold out. We're going to have to defend Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. We're going to also have to hold Malaya and Singapore and Java against the Japanese. And then the U.S. is going to of course, as it mentions in the war plan, move into positions in the Carolina and Marshall Islands, do the island hopping strategy, form that line of communication with the Philippines, and then move from there. Well, December 7th, everything goes to crap. And
not the title of the chapter in your forthcoming book.
Yes. The Philippines is gone. Singapore is gone. Hong Kong is gone. So Plan Orange is a little bit, well, there's been a big old monkey wrench that has been thrown into it. So now the focus is maintaining a line of communication with Australia. Japanese were looking to move down through the Solomons and get all the way to like maybe Fiji or Samoa and cut off that line of communication between Hawaii and Australia. But of course, you have the Battle of Coral Sea, Battle of Midway. And it's from that point that the U.S. starts devising this new strategy. This is the map that I was thinking about earlier whenever I was trying to find that one. There you can see on the right the Marshall Islands, and then directly to the west you have the Caroline Islands. There's an island there called Truk. It's called like the Gibraltar of the Pacific. And then just north of that is where you have the Marianas, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and all of those.
And just a reminder, folks, that we'll have John McManus on Friday, who will go through some of this mid-war thinking about the idea of the island hopping from the ones that they needed and ignoring the ones like Truk that they would kind of bypass and sort of siege out, and then the kind of two-pronged push towards Japan, the Philippines route, and then the island hopping route. But it's that, as John will go through that, and you've talked about it now. But these plans, they were made as they went along. As the war progressed and things happened, they kind of it affected their focus and their priorities changed, and they realized, okay, let's focus on what's important. But anyway, I'll hand it back to you. But it's Truk is one of the ones that we just bypassed in the end, didn't we?
Yeah, it ends up getting bombed.
It bombed a lot,
but,
and
Okay, so with organizing the Pacific Theater, one of these days we'll get to Operation Forager, but kind of laying the foundation here. So the Joint Chiefs organized Pacific into two primary commands. You have the Southwest Pacific area that falls under the command of MacArthur, and then the Pacific Ocean area, which is going to be commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz. And here on this map, you can kind of see the Southwest Pacific area there, and then the Pacific Ocean areas get divided up into three parts: the North, Central, and South Pacific. So the Central Pacific is the one in question. And the one who keeps advocating for a drive through the Marianas is Admiral Ernest King. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And at all of these different conferences, like at Casablanca, the Trident Conference, and Quebec, he keeps pushing for this move up through the Mariana Islands. Of course, MacArthur is vehemently opposed to that. MacArthur thinks that all of the resources need to go to MacArthur, and he wants to drive through the Philippines. But in the fall of 1943, there's a new factor that enters into the equation that make the Mariana Islands really a very attractive target, and that is the B-29. So once the B-29 superfortress came online, there are really three options that the Allied planners were looking at as far as how to use this thing. One is to base them on Australia to knock out the petroleum operations in the Dutch East Indies. As a matter of fact, Lieutenant General George Kenney of the 5th Army Air Force, he was begging for these things and thought that that's where they should be used. Another possibility was China. That's going to put them within bombing range of the Japanese, but you have the logistical difficulties of getting over the hump. There was also some questions about if the Chinese would really defend the airfields effectively against the Japanese once these superfortresses started bombing Japan. So anyway, the Marianas ended up being the most logical conclusion, or the most logical place to attack, because they're going to be within 1,500 miles of the cruising radius of a B-29. Okay, so finally, getting to Operation Forager. Okay, so this is going to be a combined Army, Marine, Naval operation to take the Mariana Islands. Originally, it was slated for November of 1944, but ends up getting bumped up to June 15th of 1944 after a lot of successes like at Kwajalein and Huitt there in the Central Pacific. So ground operations. One thing that I really struggle with whenever I'm studying the Pacific is the command structure gets really, it's like a tangled spider web to me in a lot of ways, and they change names and everything like that. So I'm going to try and keep it kind of simple as far as the command structure, and really kind of focus more in on the ground operations. But anyway, the 5th Amphibious Corps is going to be designated the Northern Troop and Landing Force, and then this is going to be Saipan and Tinian. And then for Guam, that's designated the Southern Troop and Landing Force, and that's going to go to the 3rd Amphibious Corps. Okay, so under the 5th Amphibious Corps, these are the guys who are going to be fighting in Saipan and Tinian. That's going to be the 2nd Marine Division, 4th Marine Division, and the 27th Infantry Division, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think the 27th was the first division that was activated after Pearl Harbor. And overall command of the ground forces there in 5th Army Command, or 5th Amphibious Corps, I'm sorry, is Holland Howlin' Mad Smith. Okay, and he has the name Howlin' Mad for a reason. He has this volcanic temper. 2nd Marine Division is going to be commanded by General Thomas Watson. The 2nd Marine Division, there are elements of the 2nd Marine Division that had seen action in Guadalcanal. They had also participated in the Battle of Tarawa. And then you have the 4th Marine Division, commanded by General Harry Schmidt. They had fought at Kwajalein. And then the 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Ralph Smith. Some elements had seen action at Macon Atoll and Inuitak. And there's going to be a lot of friction between Ralph Smith and Holland Smith. Okay, so for Saipan, we're 1,260 miles from Tokyo. It's a relatively small island, even though it's the 2nd largest island in the Marianas. It's about 12.5 miles or 20 kilometers long, about 5.5 miles wide. Whenever you go to Saipan today, it's really difficult to kind of get your bearings at times because the landscape looks so different. So like in Normandy, Paul, you and I have talked a little bit about how there are some differences. There's been like some urban sprawl and things like that. My own personal experience, whenever I go to Normandy, I kind of feel like it's a little bit like 1944 in some ways. Saipan is completely different.
The skeleton of the road network is as it was. The main features there, but and we're going to come to this later. That post the immediate invasions, these islands just became massive, huge, great air bases, didn't they? I mean, of sizes we can't even comprehend how many tens of thousands of Americans were living on these bases. And then the post-war changes. So yeah, I can imagine that there's things that obviously do look like they did, and other bits that are beyond all recognition.
Yeah, and there's with Saipan, there's a little bit of that urban sprawl that has changed the battlefield a little bit. The biggest thing is in 1944, the Japanese have used this island as a giant sugarcane production facility. There's a sugarcane refinery there. There's a rail network that goes all the way around the island. The whole island is sugarcane, and you cannot find a sugarcane plant there today. And the jungle has taken over everything. So it's pretty woolly now. There's about 54 miles of coastline, only 14 miles of beaches, though. There's a lot of cliffs, so a lot of stuff that it would be impossible to land on. U.S. intelligence estimated there were about 15,000 defenders on the island. And whenever they landed, well, it turns out there were about 32,000 defenders on the island. So they'd had some difficulties with reconnaissance with Saipan. Anytime they did flyovers, there was cloud cover. I don't want to say that they were going in completely ignorant, but it wasn't the best intelligence that they were going in with. So Japanese defenders, here's another thing. Whenever you're talking about like the war in Europe, you have Rommels and you have, all of these people who you're familiar with, and different units like the 12th SS, Panzer Division, stuff like that. The average World War II enthusiast probably doesn't know a whole lot about the Japanese. You might know a handful. You might know like a Yamamoto or something like that.
Guilty as charged, my lord. Yes,
and so am I. So that's one thing that I've tried to do, is learn a little bit more about the Japanese that the U.S. is fighting against. So anyway, you have 31st Army Group. They're in control of the Marianas Mandates, and whenever you're talking about an Army group, that's about like an Army Corps for the U.S. Saipan is going to be defended by the 43rd Division. They were called the Honor Division. I think they'd come out of Manchuria, I think. And there's just a hodgepodge of units there. The U.S. submarines had just wreaked havoc on the Japanese shipping and troop movements, and there were literally just little bits and pieces of Japanese soldiers and units that were floating in, and they would just like land on Saipan. The guy who's going to be in overall command of ground forces in Saipan is Lieutenant General Saito. Not a lot is known about him. And then there's another pretty well-known figure who's going to be on Saipan, and that's Admiral Nagumo, who had led the main carrier battle group at Pearl Harbor. And he had been defeated at Midway and then found himself on Saipan. Okay, so when we're looking at Saipan, the initial invasion or initial landing is going to be conducted by the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. The 27th Division was going to be held in reserve, and the idea was that the Marines were going to go in, they're going to just mop up the Japanese, and then the 27th is going to go down to Guam, and they're going to participate in that invasion. That ends up not being the case. The 27th is going to end up being deployed really within the first few days. But if you see there on the map on the left, you can see where the primary landing is taking place there on the southwest part of the island. The landing beaches were divided up into 4 different parts, codenamed red, green, blue, and yellow. The 2nd Marine Division is going to be landing on red and green, and the 4th Marine Division is going to be on blue and yellow. Okay, now one of the things that they found out the hard way at Tarawa is that the reefs were a huge problem for troops who were trying to land in the LCVPs, the Higgins boats. They were getting hung up on these reefs, and then troops are having to get out and then wade ashore, hundreds and hundreds of yards, and was causing a lot of problems. So there were some LVTs or some Amtraks that were at sorry, I got run over by my train of thought there. They're going to be using LVTs a lot more at Saipan than they had in previous conflicts. And here you can see some of those. And right here, looking at one of the landing beaches. And as you can see, the landing beach is really quite small. So Paul, if you wouldn't mind, let's go to that first video.
So the reef drone one?
Yes.
So this is the video you took there, what, 2 months ago now, a month ago, something like that?
Yeah, I was there. I was there at the beginning of June. Okay. Really right there close to the anniversary of the landing.
Brilliant. So I will just fire that up. So here we go, folks. Live, nearly live footage.
Okay, so right here, this is on Landing Beach. Excuse me, Landing Beach Red. So this is the area that the 2nd Marine Division would have landed on. And as you look out, you can see where those waves are breaking right there on the reef. And you can wade whenever the tide is low. You can wade all the way out to that. Now, if you get beyond that, it drops off fast. So quite a bit different than something that I was used to seeing like at Normandy or anything else. So they had to have these Amtraks to get over those reefs. Amtraks, they would carry anywhere from 20 to 24 troops as they were going in. And then this is the view that they would have had going into the beach.
And then this is when I said earlier about these fantastical environments. I mean, if you're a kid from Milwaukee and one of the things that day, this is going to look like, something you've never imagined. Even today, with our ability to use Google Earth and we see documentaries in color all the time and 3D footage, it's amazing. But if, back then when the school textbooks maybe had one black and white line drawing of foreign countries, and this is what you're seeing that day, just incredible. Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, stuff. And then there in that last shot, you saw the knocked out. Well, I say knocked out. There are 3 Sherman tanks that are still there in the lagoon, and like I said, at low tide, you can wade right out to them. So I went out to it and jumped up on it and crawled around a little bit, and then got back down. And as I was coming back in, I was in about chest deep water, and I was thinking, my goodness, for those guys like at Tarawa who had to jump out at the reef and then wade 500-600 yards in full pack with people shooting at them. I was just carrying a GoPro at that time, and I was like, good grief, this would be horrible. Which is, I mean, one kind of thing that going to these places does is it kind of immerses you in the environment and in the experience. Okay, so anyway, let me go back here. So if you look at this picture, one thing about the beaches in Saipan, like I said, you're talking about a beach that's maybe 15 meters around in there. So these guys had to get off of the beach quick, or else it's going to get choked up, like what you see there. Now the Japanese had been in the process of building up their defenses on Saipan. They were expecting the U.S. to not be able to land really until when the U.S. had originally planned to land there at Saipan, which is in November of 44. So whenever they land in June, the Japanese had some defense structures in place, but right there at the last minute, they really had to kind of rush to build up some bunkers and things like that. Go ahead and go to the next video on Saipan 2 bunker.
Yep, we'll do that. Hang on.
So again, this is going to be on Landing Beach Red. And we're just inland a little bit. And Paul, I know you and I have talked about, German bunkers quite a bit and the different varieties. And I'm kind of a bunker junkie. Whenever I was there, Eric Dorr.
Well, I like that word, bunker junkie.
Yeah. He said, man, you really like the bunkers.
Yeah.
But anyway, here's an example of one of the Japanese bunkers. And I found these things to be incredibly fascinating. One thing that the Japanese did well was their camouflage of bunkers. Man, they are, it is phenomenal how adept they were at taking these things and blending them into the environment. Now, of course, now it's in the middle of, this one in particular is in the middle of a park. So it's going to stand out a little bit. And then here you can see, kind of the armaments that would have been
it's also partly because they can't bring materials in. We're looking at from the Western ETO theater, the Germans bringing concrete to build bunkers. Of course, there it's much more having to incorporate with the stuff they have around, be it coral, stone, rock, whatever. So by the nature of using the stuff that's on the place already, the camouflage, in a sense, is taking care of itself, isn't it? If you're making it out of you know, the local stuff. So
yeah,
it is partly because they're clever and they're camouflage, but it's also because of just the nature of what they're doing.
Yeah, I just saw somebody comment that the term bunker junkie should be on a t-shirt. I'm gonna that's awesome.
I am considering doing for next year when I go to We Have Waves Fest is having a line of World War II TV merchandise that has those kind of, because like the James now have the bring up the Piet thing. I just haven't really come up with the bunker junkie. I kind of like that. So Woody, I'm one of Woody's bunker junkies. That was,
you can have that one.
JD and Woody's bunker junkies. It's getting too much. I'm overthinking it now, but yeah, that's good. I'm going to write that one down.
Oh man! All right, so if I go to this next slide, all of the Marines who invaded here on the red, green, and blue and yellow beaches, there was one particular feature that was kind of a marker for them that they would guide off of, and that really was the dividing point between the 2nd Marine Division and 4th Marine Division landing beaches. There was a sugar refinery in Sharan-Kanoa town there in the southern part of Saipan, and it had this smokestack that stuck up, and then there was a pier that divided those two places. But they were able to kind of look at that smokestack and kind of gauge where they were. There was a little bit of some drifting that occurred. I know that some of them on Landing Beach Green, which I think that was the 8th Regiment, ended up going a little bit north, but it's nothing like what you really see in Normandy. Everybody pretty much lands where they're supposed to, and this is a soldier's graphic depiction of that landing beach, and you can see I'm moving my mouse around here as if you guys can see it, but I forgot that you can't. If you look there,
use our imaginations. Yeah,
yeah. So you can see the smokestack, that black tower sticking up there in the middle, and then coming out into the water. That is the sugar dock, where the Japanese would load up their raw sugar. And then this is a picture showing the sugar dock, and then you can see the sugar refinery there in the background with the smokestack. If you would go ahead and pull up the video, Saipan 3 sugar dock.
There we go.
So here's some archival footage showing the destruction of the sugar refinery, and there's the sugar dock. So you have some engineers who are, moving in and kind of building a little bit of a road network. Okay, so you can see everybody stacked up. Okay, so at this point right here, you're standing on the sugar dock. In the background there, you can see the highest point on Saipan, that is Mount Tapacho. And then this is what the sugar dock looks like today. The sugar refinery is gone and the smokestack is gone. It's no longer there. But there on the left, that's where the 2nd Marine Division would have landed. And then here on the right is where the 4th Marine Division would have landed, including Lee Marvin. Okay, so he would have hopped off right here along the beach that you can see in the distance.
Worth mentioning, folks, if you haven't seen it already, to watch the show with Stephen McLeod, who was on last year, Black Dragon, about the landings in Saipan, and I had an email from today. He's planning, folks, if you're interested in visiting these areas, he's planning to get back touring again, taking groups of Americans to Saipan on one of his tours as a historian. So there are opportunities, folks, to go to some of these places with someone like Stephen McLeod, who for Black Dragon, which is an amazing book, and if you go back and watch the show, an amazing presentation. So these places are, the world is opening up again in this, I'm not going to say post-COVID world, but kind of through the worst, fingers crossed, COVID world we're at now.
Yeah, I saw a question there from Bradley Ness, said, I wonder how much the battle changed the beach permanently. From what I could see, there aren't any big changes to the beach. But if you get out into the reef, there's still shell craters out there. So you might be walking along and then you're in chest deep water, and then all of a sudden you're, over your head. So yeah, it can, it has definitely changed out there, which is one thing that I forgot to mention. As these guys were coming in, there were some UDT teams, underwater demolition teams, that had reconnoitered the reefs and the beach the day before the landing. And then whenever the Marines started coming in, as they were approaching the reef, they saw these red flags along the reef. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what those are. Well, they were range markers for the Japanese. And after they crossed that barrier, and the artillery strikes were just murderous to these people.
And we're getting a question about how you were treated there, going just with your camera going around there. Just the people who are there, the locals, other tourists. You obviously you came back okay, so it must have been a fairly successful trip.
Yeah. So Saipan gets a lot of Japanese tourists. There were no tourists there whenever I was there. I think Japan is still pretty buttoned up as far as travel goes. So Saipan is an American territory. So you have some people who have moved from the mainland there and live on Saipan now, and then you also have the descendants of the native Chamorro people. And Saipan was awesome. It's like it has a very small town feel to it. I loved Saipan. I loved my time there. The people were awesome. And linked up with a guy named Fred, who grew up there and kind of served as a guide for me whenever we get like into the high ground and going through the jungle. I'll talk about him a little bit more in a bit. One thing that did kind of strike me whenever I first got to Saipan, that kind of made the experience a little bit more immersive. Because I mean, anywhere you go, you stand and you're like, man, I wonder what it was like for the guys who were here. The heat in Saipan is suffocating. It is unlike any other heat that I've ever experienced in my life. And I live in the Midwest where, we have a lot of humidity and things like that. It is nothing like Saipan. One guy that I talked to who had linked me up with Fred, his name is Scott. He had moved to Saipan from California 20 years ago. And I was talking about, just the heat and how suffocating the humidity was and everything like that. And he said, you learn to live with it. He said, I stepped off of the plane in Saipan 20 years ago. He said, I immediately started sweating and I haven't stopped sweating since. And that's the truth. Like even middle of the night, it is horribly hot. I was putting down like 5 or 6 32-ounce Gatorades a day, plus whatever water I could. And I was still thirsty just all the time. So these guys who are landing on this beach, water was a significant problem that they were running into. Now I'm just running around with a camera. I don't have any gear. I don't have a rifle, M1 Garand that I'm packing around. Nobody is shooting at me. And I was consuming more water than I've ever consumed in any one place in my life.
Yeah.
And these guys have a canteen.
I mean, and this has been a recurring when we've had John McManus and Ian W. Toll on, and there are some water sources as the Allies push their way across, but a lot of it has to still be brought hundreds, if not thousands of miles. I mean, Iwo Jima, for example, but yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, viewers, but I believe every kind of ounce of water that was consumed there had to be brought in. It was all brought in by the Americans. So that volume, when we talk about how big these bases were in the months that followed and how many American personnel were there, just the logistics of keeping everybody with fresh drinking water are just astronomical, aren't they?
Well, and here's another thing. So yeah, they had some water that they bring into these guys. and they bring them in these 55-gallon drums. So they start dipping this water out, take a drink of it, and it tastes like diesel. And it turns out that somebody had the bright idea of repurposing these 55-gallon drums and just like scrubbing them. And they're like, okay, we'll wipe it out a little bit. That'll get the diesel out, and then refill it. And so, I mean, just imagine being as thirsty as you've ever been, and you finally are getting a canteen full of water, and you throw it right back up because it tastes like diesel. And there was whenever Fred and I went back in the jungle one day, we were looking for a specific cave. Again, you know, we talk about the humidity. Really, the bigger factor whenever you're talking about like the weather and everything is dew point. So dew point is kind of the temperature to where air is cooled, where it starts to become saturated and turns into dew or water vapor. Well, whenever the dew point is really high, your body sweats, but that sweat doesn't evaporate and cool you down. So you're just miserable. And I took a look beforehand. Anything over 75 degrees is considered oppressively uncomfortable with dew point. Today in Saipan, it's 77, and it's like that all the time, I think. Oh. But anyway, we went back in the jungle, and Fred hadn't been to this cave in a while. There had been a typhoon that had blown in, and there were trees down and all kinds of obstacles that were in the way. Everything looked different to him. And plus there was this, they have a poison plant called velvet bean that is super, super poisonous. Like he did not want to mess with this stuff at all. And it had grown everywhere. Long story short, we went in and I just took a bottle of water, and it took us a lot longer to get through the jungle, and it's super mountainous and super hilly. And whenever you see that episode, by the time we get to the cave, I probably don't sound too enthusiastic that we found it, because by that point I was spent and I was done. And at one point I thought, man, if I had to fight right now, I would lose. Like I would not have it in me, and I'm in reasonable physical condition. So anyway, I read one account where a lieutenant talked about the heat casualties that he had in his outfit, and it'd be interesting to see how many heat casualties there were in Saipan. Okay,
and this is what I wanted you on, Jay. It's that personal insight into this, because someone asked earlier about, and I'll try and find it there. Did visiting those battlefields give you the same somber feelings that you get at, say, Gettysburg? And it's a pertinent question, but if you're just dealing with how uncomfortable you are, as I imagine you are in this environment, kind of taking on board, so how do I feel about this? Is there an atmosphere here? You can't, there's no room in your brain for that kind of work, for that process, because you're just uncomfortable. And going back, as you said there, to actually having to fight in this, you're having to follow orders as a section squad leader, or you're giving orders, and you've got objectives to reach, you've got ammunition to conserve, and yet you're just feeling like shit because you're so hot and you're so sweaty, and it adds the whole dimension to this that when we look at the Pacific campaign, or even the Eastern Front for the cold, that we don't have that with the ETO. We don't have that dealing with just the environment on a constant survival basis. The environment of Normandy is deadly, but it's deadly because of artillery and mortars, not because of just not drinking enough water.
Yeah, and I remember reading somewhere, and I tried to find it, and I couldn't I couldn't recall it in time, for our talk today. I seem to remember reading at some point a comparison with the psychiatric casualties in Europe versus the Pacific. And I seem to remember the psychiatric casualties in the Pacific being reasonably higher than what we see in the European theater. And one thing I found just going through there is that you're fighting the environment as much as you're fighting anything. And then you add, these Japanese defenders on top of that, who are fighting a very different style of warfare than. And I don't want to say one's better or worse. They're just different.
Yeah.
But these guys are fighting to the death. And so I have to wonder. I know that your body will typically break before your mind does. And I wonder how much the environment plays a role in the psychiatric casualties in the Pacific Theater.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to compound everything, isn't it? And people are asking questions about how they dealt with malaria, how they dealt with high dehydration, all those things. That everything the medical teams are facing is compounded and on a scale beyond what they'd have experienced in training because of these conditions. So, the simple thing of cleaning wounds, hydrating people, you're having to conserve water. Everyone's sweaty, everyone's stinging because there's sweats in their eyes, and the risk of infection is increased. And we haven't even got onto the, as well, you mentioned the poisonous plants and the insects and the snakes and everything else that can get you, and cutting yourself on coral. Anyone in Australia who's watching this, who's been out and caught themselves on a bit of reef coral, horrible cuts that don't heal, and salt water getting them, and so everything is just and delirious. Yeah, you're if you're not consuming enough water, and sunstroke as well. I mean, there's so many.
Yeah.
You a whole show just about the myriad of ways it was shit for these guys, and yet they're still fight across these beaches. Incredible.
I got burned so bad one day. Oh my gosh. It was awful. The sun is different in Saipan. They have a different sun than anywhere else on the planet. And yeah, there was one day I just got absolutely roasted. So yeah, there are all those elements that are all contributing.
Well, I feel we should move on. Otherwise, we're disappearing down
I know.
Very fascinating, interesting rabbit hole. But let's
okay, so this is looking at the southern part of the island. One of the main objectives early on in the Saipan campaign was the Aslito airfield down at the very bottom. They wanted to capture that thing in a hurry. So the 4th Marine Division is moving in by this point. This is probably about 3 days into the battle. The 27th Infantry Division has been called in for reinforcements. The airfield, the airfield ends up being kind of lightly defended. So whenever you look at Saipan, this area that we're looking at right here is more flat than any other places. And then you can see on the contour lines there at the top of the picture, it starts getting into some real hilly, mountainous terrain. As a matter of fact, I think there, at the top you can see Mount Tapachau, which is the highest point. But anyway, go ahead and go to Saipan Aslito Airfield. So this is one of the Japanese bunkers that rings Aslito Airfield, and there were tons of these all over the place. So this was kind of like the main command center, I guess you could say, on Saipan. And having been to Normandy and seeing being up in Belgium and seeing the different varieties of bunkers there, looking at the construction of the Japanese bunkers was really something else. And Paul, like you mentioned, these are all things that they have to source from the island. Okay, so here we are going inside, and if I were to just stand completely upright, I'm probably about 5'10", 5'11". So I would say that probably about 6 foot, maybe a little over at its highest point. But like I said, the airfield didn't give these guys much of a problem. The Japanese pretty much withdrew because it was going to be a little bit the ground to the north was going to be much easier to defend. Okay, so moving north, one of the main features that is talked about whenever you're talking about the Battle of Saipan is Purple Heart Ridge and Death Valley. Now, Purple Heart Ridge, it's a little bit deceptive. It is a ridge, but it's more a bunch of super steep hills that make up a ridge. And then on the western side, you have this high ground, and then it's topped with Mount Tapachau. So at this point in the battle, around the 23rd of June, let's see, I'm assuming that none of the Japanese earth and log bunkers no longer survive. No, it's just concrete bunkers that are there now. You have the 2nd Marine Division on the western side of the island. The 4th Marine Division has moved over to the right side of the island. They're in the Cagman Peninsula, so they're clearing that out. And the 27th Infantry Division is going to be heading right up the middle. And Holland Smith, this is where Holland Smith and Ralph Smith, who was the commander of the 27th, are going to come to a serious disagreement that's going to end up leading to Ralph Smith being dismissed. You have a Marine general who is firing an Army general. So there's this inter-service thing that is going on. So, but the 27th, a lot of these guys are new to combat, and they are being asked to go right up the middle of this valley with high ground on both sides of them, and it's a fatal funnel that they are being pushed into. So they would go in and they would get pushed back. They would go in, they would get pushed back, and Holland Smith was saying that these guys are cowards, that they're not fighting hard enough, and that if he sent the Marines in there, they would be able to push through. So go ahead and go to the video on Mount Tapachau. Right. So I got up on the highest point of the island, and whenever you get up there, you can see what these guys had to deal with. Okay, so there in the distance, this is looking towards the western side of the island. There are our landing beaches. That lake right there in the middle was a real marshy area, caused a lot of problems for the Amtraks as they were coming in. Okay, and then there on the far southern part of the island is Aslito Airfield. And then if you look, go ahead and play the video a little bit more.
You can kind of see those kind of ridges. They kind of look like the dinosaur backs, almost, or dragon the backs snaking their way up those ridges there. It's a really interesting terrain, isn't it?
The terrain is nasty. It's nasty. And where I'm at on Mount Tapachau, it goes almost straight down. I don't know how those guys did it. So yeah, there you see the airfield in the background. And then there on the right, you can kind of see that little ridge coming up. Off to the left of that is Death Valley. And then there in the distance, you can see another rise. That's Purple Heart Ridge. So right there where that water spot is covering right now is Purple Heart Ridge. And there were like 7 or 8 little hills right through there. So imagine being, in the 27th Infantry Division, and there I'm pointing at that one ridge, and being asked to go through there. I mean, you had the Japanese had a commanding view, and these guys just got chewed up trying to take this thing.
I mean, it's classic canalization, isn't it? It's classic enemy have the high ground, and the attackers are coming up the only usable valleys between the ridges, because so that they know exactly where they're going to come from and can concentrate their fire on it. It's yeah. And we were asking, is obviously the elevation of the terrain is okay. The vegetation, is that kind of as it was?
No. So, like I said earlier, this would have been all like any part, any tillable ground at all, and even some that's maybe non-tillable would have been covered in sugarcane.
Right.
It, yeah, it's and now it's overtaken by the jungle. So it looks a lot different than it would.
Sean Brennan is asking about, is there more than one Death Valley? And I guess that's that kind of thing like you get with Bloody Gulch here in Normandy, is that each unit has a slightly different location for their part of Bloody Gulch. So Death Valley is if I'm following this, I remember what Stephen McLeod says, it's kind of a series of places and everyone's part of it is slightly different. Is that right? Or is there one distinct actual valley?
There's one distinct valley that cuts through there. Now there might be other Death Valleys in other campaigns. I'm only familiar with one Death Valley on Saipan. It's kind of like in the Civil War. There's several cornfields and sunken roads and everything like that. Depending on which battle.
No problem.
Okay, and then this is up towards the north part of the island. This is early July, so it's the 5th through the 8th of 1944. Japanese have been pushed up to this corner, and again, this is really, really rugged terrain. But there on the western side, it kind of flattens out in something called the Tanapag Plain, and excuse me, it's right here where the largest bonsai charge of the Pacific War is going to take place. General Saito had been wounded and was in a cave, ends up committing suicide there. But before he dies, before he commits suicide, he orders this bonsai charge, and the Japanese word for it. I'm not good at a lot of things. One thing that I consider myself an expert on is mispronouncing words. I think I'm not even going to attempt it. It starts with a G, but it translates to breaking the jewel is what this bonsai charge is. This is on permanent record, so I don't want to mispronounce it and be a fool, for all of eternity. Yoksai, yeah, I think that's how you end up pronouncing it. It starts with a G though, but anyway, it translates to breaking the jewel. So on this bonsai charge, they just come pouring out, and again, it's the poor guys from the 27th Infantry Division that are getting pounded by this. And here you can see this is taken after the battle, and it's from the north looking to the south, and you can see that plain that the bonsai charge took place in, and then this is some of the aftermath. So there, that picture on the right, you can see where the engineers have used a bulldozer to dig this trench, and then just to the left there are all of these bodies of these dead Japanese soldiers who've been killed in this bonsai charge. And even today, so I mentioned that there aren't a lot of Japanese tourists who are, who were at the island at that time because of travel. But there's a lot of Japanese tourists who come to the island, and there are some resorts, along the coast. This area right here along the Tanapag Plain, I show it in the series. I wish I'd have put a clip in here. There are no buildings. They can't build there because there's still too many bodies that are buried in that area. And funny story, right there, that picture on the left along the coast. So Fred and I went out there, and we're just kind of filming a little bit because the Japanese had skirted the coastline in that bonsai charge to try and push the 27th back down to the south to Garapan. But he said, "Hey, look at there." And I looked down, and right there at the edge of the water, there's a Japanese bullet that had washed up. And there's, my gosh, there's shrapnel and bullets and stuff all over that island. I found a grenade on one of our treks through the jungle. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So, and this guy right here, his name is Benjamin Solomon, and he was a dentist in the 27th Infantry Division. Well, on Saipan, they didn't really have need for anybody performing any root canals or anything like that. So he ended up volunteering to work in the aid station. So he was in an aid station there in the Tanapag Valley, just behind the front line whenever this bonsai charge cut loose. And long story short, he has just this harrowing story where he grabs an M1 Garand and is fighting off these Japanese who are coming into the aid tent. And then he mans a machine gun and allows for the evacuation of a lot of the wounded. Whenever they found him the next day, he had been killed. There was upwards of like 98 Japanese in front of the machine gun that he was manning, and he had been shot and bayoneted several times. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but was initially rejected because he was a medic and because he had a medic armband and was not supposed to be taking up arms. And then there was an argument made that, well, if you're defending yourself, it's different. But then they swung back and they said, well, he was operating a machine gun, which is a crew serviced weapon. So it wasn't just him. But anyway, later on, he ended up being posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of the few Jewish individuals who have been awarded the Medal of Honor.
Mm.
Okay. Holy cow. We still have Guam and Tinian to go.
It's good though, but yeah, yeah, whatever. It is what it is.
I'll try and buzz through these a little bit quicker.
It's good. It's good.
One of the things that really kind of marks the fighting in Saipan is the cave system. There are hundreds and hundreds of caves. And I interviewed a guy who fought with the 2nd Marine Division, and I asked him about that to describe it. And the only way he could describe it was horrifying. So, these guys would go in with flamethrowers. You'd have like maybe a 3 or 4 man team that would have to go in and clear out these caves. And if you do any caving, which I've done a lot because live in the Midwest and did that a lot whenever I was younger, going into a cave is sketchy enough as it is. Whenever you know that there might be somebody in there who has ill intent towards you, I can only imagine the stress that would be, or that would cause. But even today, so this cave right here, we went into, and there are the bones of a Japanese soldier that still reside. You can see part of his shoe back there.
Wow.
So you said something earlier, or somebody asked something earlier about, is it a sobering feeling whenever you're going to these places? This was the moment for me where it was real. Whenever you go and you can see, like a humerus or a femur and rib bones and everything like that. That's whenever it became one of the moments when it became a little bit more somber for me. And anyway, of course, you don't disturb the bones. The Japanese have I forget what the name of the organization is, but Fred has worked with them a lot, where they come and they take these bones and they bring them back to Japan and bury them. So anyway, this has been reported and marked. And there was another cave that we went in and found the head of a femur, but we didn't find any other bones in that cave.
As you say, it's completely sobering.
Yeah. Another thing about Saipan that was just an absolute tragedy and horror was how it affected the civilians. So on Saipan, there were a lot of Korean immigrants who were pressed into service in the sugarcane fields, a lot of the native Chamorros. And it's, the story's probably well known. how the Japanese told the civilians, if the Americans catch you, they're going to brutalize you in all these terrible ways. So here you can see just a few pictures of like these homes being burned out. By the way, Saipan is the first time that we see urban combat in the Pacific Campaign. And then here you can see these Marines. This was a child that was found in a cave. If the story and the picture match up, which I think they do, the reporter, the photographer who took this picture said that everybody in the cave was dead except for this child. And one of the stories that I tell that you'll see in the series, the name escapes me now, but there's a young medic who is in a cave, and there's a pregnant Japanese woman in there, and he helps her to give birth to this child in the midst of all of this death and destruction and everything. Here we have this new life. Gives birth to this child, and he turns around, and whenever he turns back to this Japanese woman, she has strangled this baby to death with her own hands. And whenever I read that story, I thought, obviously there's just the horror of that, thinking that things are going to be so bad that killing your child is better than what they've told you is to come. But I also thought about that young medic, and how did that affect these guys? And there are two cliffs on the northern part of Saipan. What you're looking at in the distance is called Suicide Cliff. And then there's another one on the coast called Bonsai Cliff, where just hundreds of these civilians were throwing their children off and then hurling themselves off. Just absolutely horrific. And I went to the top of that cliff and looked over the edge, and you kind of put yourself in the shoes of those people, thinking, man, how desperate and how scared must they have been to where this was preferable.
Yeah, and it demonstrates the power of propaganda, how they'd been convinced that the fate awaiting them was worse than this, and they all believed it. And for the Americans who experienced this, there must have been a sense of, well, it can't get worse than this. And of course it got worse. Okinawa, the numbers got greater, the tragedy got greater. So there'd have been a point, if you were an American medic witnessing what you'd seen there, well, yeah, this must have peaked. This must be peak shittiness of the war. Yep. And yet, in fact, it hadn't even peaked yet. There was more shittiness coming in even bigger numbers as the war went on. So yeah, again, that reminder that the Pacific Campaign has a level of just brutality and terror and horror that the ETO in most cases doesn't have.
Yeah, and you and I were talking, before things started, about a little bit of time that I spent in Poland, and seeing what war does to the civilians. Now, while I was there on the border, I saw a lot of tragedy and saw what this war was doing to people. I didn't see this. The idea of seeing these young kids being hurled off of this cliff had to have an effect. There's a scene in the series The Pacific in Okinawa where the character Snafu, it gets to a point where you can see his mind is just coming apart. Like he can't take it anymore. Like these guys reach the terminus of it. And a lot of focus on the psychiatric casualties and everything like that has been with combat and things like that. I have to think that this plays a role as well. And I felt really conflicted being here. You read accounts about these young soldiers and Marines just begging these people, don't jump. And they're jumping off and jumping in the ocean. And I was really conflicted here because look at this picture. What you're seeing there in the foreground is called a flame tree, and they're all over the island. And it's my new favorite tree on the planet. They're beautiful, and it's one of the most majestic looking pieces of ground and landscape that I've ever seen. But then you stand there and you're like, dang, when you know what happened there, it's sobering. So
yeah, no, the contrast between the beauty now and the tragedy of what happened there is the gulf is huge. And
yeah,
as soon as the photo came up, it's one of those photos that it's so beautiful because it could easily be the cover of a coffee table book about beautiful place in the Pacific, or some travel brochure offering you a vacation somewhere, and yet it's actually a hauntingly horrible, if not even a battlefield. It's a tragic human story of suffering. But no, amazing.
Yeah, somebody asked if I said flame tree. Yeah, that's what they're called, is flame trees.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
if they would grow in the Midwest, I would have maybe tried to bring some home.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh my gosh, we finally made it to another island. Okay, so
island hopping has been an island kind of staggered walk, but we've now hopped over to another island there. But
these last few will go a little bit quicker. So Guam was codenamed Stevedore. Ended up getting postponed a little bit. Guam, this was kind of personal to the United States. This was a U.S. territory that had been overrun by the Japanese on December 8th. So we're on the other side of the international date line, so the same time that Pearl Harbor is going on. There was an aircraft attack. The aircraft that attacked Guam actually took off from Saipan. So anyway, December 10th, Japanese troops land and the garrison surrenders. It gets overrun really in a hurry. It's the largest of the islands in the Marianas. And this is going to 3 amphibious corps. So you have the 3rd Marine Division, and then you also have this. Oh, I made an error there. So I said division there on that middle one. That should say Provisional Brigade. Sorry about that. And then the 77th Infantry Division. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so this is going to be commanded by Major General Roy Geiger. 3rd Marine Division was commanded by Major General Alan Turnage. These guys had fought at Bougainville. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, which is what I meant to have on there earlier, sorry about that, was commanded by a guy named General Lemuel Shepard. This guy was pretty interesting. He had fought in World War I. He had been wounded twice at Bella Wood. And then went back in, I think, at the San Miguel offensive, and was wounded a 3rd time. So this is a tough old guy. A Provisional Marine Brigade. This was kind of like a temporary organization. It wasn't considered permanent by the Marines. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, they initially were sent to Iceland early on in the war. And then, got built around the 4th and 22nd Marine Divisions, or regiments. So roughly about 10,000 of them. And then the 77th Infantry Division, which this was going to be their first taste of combat. Okay, and then the Defenders of Guam, the commander of the 31st Army Group was General Obata. He had been on his way to Saipan. He had been on another one of the islands and ended up being diverted whenever the invasion of Saipan started. So he ended up going to Guam. He is going to be there. There's several of these figures, but I'm only hitting a few of them. And then the largest division on Guam is the 29th Division. And again, just like Saipan, there's a mixture. There's a hodgepodge of other units that are there. Excuse me. He is going to order a massive bonsai charge on the 25th of July that is going to be a complete and utter failure. And then he's going to die a couple days later. And then command of everything is going to shift to Obata, even though he was the commander of the 31st Army Group. Now, you don't have D-Day in Guam. They call it W-Day. It had been moved to July 21st. It was originally supposed to be right there, just like within a week of the landing at Saipan. But they were running into so many problems at Saipan, they ended up delaying the landing at Guam. And they learned some lessons from Saipan, and they weren't going to repeat some of the mistakes. So this gets preceded by the largest naval and air bombardment of the Pacific War up to up to that point. And here, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see where the 3rd Marine Division is landing there to the north. So they're going to be a little bit further apart than what we see in Saipan. And then the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade is landing there to the south, and they're on the Huitt Peninsula. There was an airstrip. The idea was they wanted to take that peninsula first, secure the airstrip, and then meet in the middle, and then kind of swing like a gate and then move north along the island. And if you would go to the clip for Guam Bunker.
I'll do.
Again, you can see my favoritism towards bunkers. This is down in the 1st Marine Provisional Marine Brigade sector. And again, the reason that I wanted to show this one is look at how well that has been camouflaged and integrated into the surrounding environment.
Yeah.
So any aerial reconnaissance is probably not going to pick that up. This is on the northern end of that south landing beach. And again, very similar situation. You have the 77th Infantry Division that is in reserve, and they almost immediately get called in. And this, I wish I would have shown more of the beach right here where I'm at. A lot of people may not be familiar with the 77th Infantry Division, but you probably are familiar with a certain individual who fought with them. Desmond Doss was in the 77th, and is going to be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Okinawa. Of course, the movie Hacksaw Ridge is about the story of Desmond Doss. One thing that they get wrong, well, that's off, I guess you could say, on Hacksaw Ridge, is they kind of depict Desmond Doss as being this, fresh-faced new guy to combat who has to go in and prove himself, to all these other guys. By the time Okinawa rolled around, Desmond Doss was already Desmond Doss. And he lands right here in Guam. I think he was awarded a Bronze Star with Valor on Guam. It's either Guam or the Philippines. But yeah, Guam, I'm sorry, Desmond Doss, he was already Desmond Doss by the time Okinawa rolled around. But it was kind of interesting to see the beach where he landed. Yeah. I mentioned that Bonsai charge that takes place on the southern landing beach there, and it was going to be a complete unmitigated disaster. And the 29th Division and the other units that participate in that they destroy themselves. I think if I'm not mistaken, it was around 80% casualties that they suffer. And that's why the Guam operation really goes as fast as it does. These guys just move, right up the island.
This is the same era when in the ETO, when you're getting to sort of November, December 44 and into the spring of 45, is the Germans aren't doing ridiculous, stupid charge suicides. So they're fighting for every inch of ground and making the Allies pay for everything and slowing the Allies down. But in the Pacific, in the island, as you said, there's these Banzai charges that actually end up speeding it. They're speeding it up for the Allies. They serve no purpose really, and yet they keep doing it. It's something that it's one of those things they keep pulling out of the bag, even though it hasn't been working for them since 41, 42 maybe.
And that's one thing that no matter how many times I read about it, and you can talk about the spirit of the Japanese fighter and all that. It's been explained to me. I still don't understand it. Like from a tactical, strategic standpoint, I don't understand the Bonsai charge. Like Guam is a huge island, and in the south, holy cow, the terrain is rough and hilly and mountainous. They could have held out for who knows how long, but instead they do this Bonsai charge and destroy themselves.
Well, we should be grateful they did, because as we the basic principle was to bring our airfields, as you said earlier, closer to Japan to bring the end to the war. So they just sped about their own demise. In this case, the Japanese. So yeah.
Well, and just to show you how long they could have held out, we have this guy, Shoichi, I think is how you say it, Yokoi. This is a Japanese soldier that whenever things went south for the Japanese and they had lost, he and 9 other Japanese soldiers just went into the mountains, and they were not going to surrender. 7 of them ended up separating, and I think maybe ended up becoming prisoners or surrendered or something like that. Yokoi and 2 others were not giving up under any circumstances. So the other 2 ended up holding out until like the 60s. Yokoi wasn't found and didn't surrender until 1972. And there are several stories, you know, and I think there's another one in the Philippines and, you know, some other places of these Japanese soldiers that even after the war is long over, my uncle was flying bombing missions on B-52s to Vietnam out of Guam whenever this guy got captured.
Yeah.
He was there whenever this happened. It is a wild story.
And how deeply set their beliefs were that, you know, these people had no contact with their higher command for decades. And yet they still, all those years later, had that determination to not be found, to hold on and just wait, and someone will be coming eventually, and there's going to be some counter. It's testament to how the human mind can be so completely brainwashed, probably isn't the right word, but attuned to a principle, to an ideology that decades afterwards you're still there. That it's extraordinary.
Yeah,
it really is extraordinary.
Yeah, it really. So in one part, you know, I look at him and I'm like, man, that guy's crazy. There's no look at how much of his life he lost. There's another part of me that looks at him and is like, dang, the dude is tough to hold out that long. You know, there's some interesting stories of, you know, how he survived and was living on mangoes and papayas, and he would like watch animals and see what they would eat, and if they ate it, he knew that it was safe, that it wasn't a poison plant. He was making like fish traps out of reeds, and that's actually how he ended up being captured. There were some hunters that stumbled on him while he was checking one of his traps, I believe, and he was so weak that he couldn't, you know, fight back. But yeah, held out until 1972. He ended up, he thought that he was going to be returning home in shame, and he ended up being kind of a bit of a celebrity. He was like one of the last holdouts, and he died early to mid 90s, I think. And kind of an interesting story. They assumed that he was dead, and they had a grave marker for him. So whenever he actually died, they ended up burying him under the grave marker that they had had in the cemetery for years. Yeah. Wow. But okay, so anyway, after Guam, then we get to the Battle of Tinian, very, very small island. One thing that kind of surprised me, I didn't realize it was as close to Saipan as what it is. You can stand on the southern end of Saipan and see Tinian. As a matter of fact, go ahead and go to that first Tinian. I think it's called Tinian Flight.
Yep.
Now Tinian is flat, and I got to sit in the front seat of this little puddle jumper and fly over. But in the same way that Saipan is all sugarcane fields, Tinian was the same way. There's one rise in the middle of the island. Okay, so you can see we're taking off from Saipan, and there's Tinian right there.
Right, yep.
So while the Battle of Saipan is, you know, raging, these Japanese troops are on this island, and there's nothing that they can do. They're just kind of holding out. Now, the U.S. ended up, while Saipan was going on, ended up sending artillery fire. Of course, Tinian is valuable because of the air base, and at the end of that clip, you could see the airstrips that the Seabees are going to be building. Right there. Yeah. There's 4 airstrips that have, as you can see, almost been taken over by the jungle. This is where the B-29s are going to be taking off to bomb Japan, and it's also where the Enola Gay and Boxcar are going to be taking off from to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
That aircraft looks like a Renault 5 with kind of glued on wings.
Oh man,
it looks a little, yeah, primitive. It's maybe not the right, but yeah.
Oh, it was. And they told me, whenever I went over there, they were like, okay, go ahead and hop in the front. I get there and there's, like the stick there. And I looked at the pilot and I said, my goal on this trip is to touch nothing. Because you're right there with it. The ride back was rough as heck because it was later in the day. And whenever it gets, hotter, there are like these updrafts and oh my gosh. It was an experience. Okay, so the Battle of Tinian is going to be going right back to the 4th and 2nd Marine Divisions. The 27th had pretty much been spent as an effective combat fighting force. So this is going to go to the 2nd and 4th Marines. And if I go back, so if you look at the southern part of the island, there on the southwest portion, there's the town. It's called Tinian Town. This is where the Japanese thought that an American landing was going to take place. It's the most accessible beaches. You're right there at an urban area where you can quickly take over it. They thought, okay, if they don't attack there, well, then the next most logical place is where you see that says Asiga Bay on Yellow Beach. They thought that'll be the next spot. There is a little bit of a spot up around the northwest corner where you see the white beaches, but the Japanese assumed there's no way that they would land there because the beaches aren't big enough. So what the Marines end up doing is they go to the least likely spot and kind of slip in the back door. So here you see, I think this is at White 2, I think. And then I believe, I could be mistaken on this, but I think this is at Landing Beach 1 or White 1. So the 4th Marines are coming in. 4th Marine Division is coming in first. The 2nd Marine Division was going to be coming in the following day. And it was really important that these guys get on the beach and move out because the beaches were so small that it would bottleneck and become easily congested. So if you would go to Tinian White 1.
I'll do it.
Now, take a look at this beach. As we pull back, that's it. That's the beach that they land on. You're probably looking at about 60 to 65 yards is the width of that beach. So that's why the Japanese thought that there was no way that the U.S. would land there because it just wouldn't support it. So what they ended up doing is kind of staggering in, and they also constructed these.
I'm playing it again. What the
yeah,
hell?
yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a short clip. They end up constructing these apparatuses that have ramps on them hooked up to, I think it was to the Amtraks, where they could get off on the rocks and wouldn't just be limited to that beach area. But again, coming from the perspective of, having spent time on the Normandy beaches and thinking about, all of those regiments coming in, and then you look at that tiny thing there, and you're like, how in the heck did they do this?
Bradley's questions. How many people came ashore on that beach then? Do we know?
So they crud. I don't have that off the top of my head. Yeah, I'm not sure how many came in right there.
It's the leapfrogging technique, isn't it? It's the one goes in, gets the shoreline, then another lot comes in and overlaps that and goes a few feet in, and that's the idea, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Well, and the U.S. did everything they could to reinforce the idea that they were going to be attacking at Tinian Town there in the southwest. So, I mean, there were some defenses here, but it's light compared to what they had experienced in other places, but pretty remarkable that, I mean, that was a pretty bold move, to funnel everybody in right there through those beaches. And like I said, Tinian is about as flat as a pancake. And whenever I was there, Tinian was maybe one of my favorite stops on the trip. I got there and I felt like I was the last man on earth. There was nobody there, and like nature is reclaiming everything on that island. You would think that, you know, the place that once was like the busiest airport in the world, or busiest airfield in the world, there would be, I don't know, like a visitor center, or there would be something there, maybe a little museum. It's nothing. It felt like I was on the set of The Walking Dead.
Wow.
And as a matter of fact, there's, like I said, there's 4 different airfields there. I had my little rental car that I had picked up. There's only one gas station on the entire island, and the gas there was extremely expensive, even more expensive than, you know, what's normal right now. But I drove up there. I did end up running into like somebody that, I don't know why they were there. They were just up there looking the same way I was. But for the rest of the time, I had the island to myself. But you can drive on the airstrips. So I was like, well,
Wow.
heck, let's drive on the airstrip. So I went to one end and then just stomped on the gas and drove as fast as I could down this airstrip where all of these B-29s took off from. It was, I don't know, kind of a cool experience.
Well, I'm just looking at some data now. I mean, it was 42,000 people landed on that island, Tinian, in the early stages. It was 15,000 CBs there just building the airfields, and that's before the airfields were even operational. So by the time you got the B-29 squadrons there, I mean, it's tens of thousands of personnel, and you felt like when you were there, you were the last person on Earth. And that's the interesting thing about, as you see, Normandy or Market Garden, you're walking through the areas now, there's still population there, about the same level of busyness now as they would have been. These places, some have just been, they were important for a few months in World War II, and now they're just a place, just an insignificant place in the middle of the Pacific. But fascinating stuff.
Oh, it was so wild, so wild. And then this is what Tinian is going to look like after the CBs move in and do the thing. So think about that image that we saw earlier whenever I was flying in, and there are really 2 of the airstrips that you can barely even see from the air. You can only really see the northern 2 clearly, compared to what it was. Like I said, I think at one point it was the busiest airstrip on planet Earth.
I believe I've read that. And so we've got that last clip now, the bomb pit, isn't it? So I'll share that. Then we'll kind of eventually
that'll wrap
Brilliant.
it.
So there we go.
Okay, so whenever you talk about standing in historic spots, this is one of them. This is the bomb pit where they loaded Little Boy onto the Enola Gay, and it took off to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. So this is bomb pit number 1. From where I'm standing right here, behind me is bomb pit number 2, which is where Fat Man was loaded up on boxcar to go to Nagasaki. And like I said, I had the place to myself. It was wild. Like I said, it felt like I was on the set of The Walking Dead or something like that. But again, another one of those places where you just kind of imagine all the activity and all that was going on, and now it's, well, what you can see.
And we've got the question about how much of the base is left beside the runway. And I guess the answer is nothing, pretty much nothing.
Not much. It's
lines.
Shadows. As far as like any like buildings or structures, like I found a few old Japanese buildings. The building where the bomb was put together, or where they armed it, is gone. I show that in one of the videos. You can see the footprint of where the building was, but yeah, it's largely been lost to history. But
well, That dovetails nicely to my final question for you, which we know what you're going to be doing with this footage, but what are your aims for this series to do? Because you've done different things. People have been talking about your Gettysburg series, your shows in Normandy, where I featured in some of them. You've done your artifacts ones with Eric. So for your History Underground audience, which there's an overlap with my audience, but there's slightly differences as well. What this is a really crass interviewer's question, but what journey are you hoping to take these people on? But that is going to be my question. I'm going to stand by it. When people sign, I guess you're going to be doing a series of these. What are you trying to convey through these videos?
I want people to be able to see an area of the Second World War that probably doesn't get just a whole lot of attention.
Yeah.
Like I said, there's a lot of people, their grandpa, their great grandpa fought in these places. And, kind of circling back all the way to, what we were talking about at the beginning, even during the war, there was a Europe first mentality, or a Germany first mentality. And we'll go take care of the Pacific afterwards. And people were very disconnected from it. Guam, in preparing for the series, I struggled with preparing for Guam, because the resources available just aren't that much. Go to Amazon and look up books on Guam, and then look up books on Normandy,
or even Iwo Jima.
Iwo Jima.
That we talk about all the time is that it's those favorite subjects that just get analyzed again and again and again, often brilliantly and often with new insight. But yet there are these other areas that just seem to not really have the interest, and it's fascinating. I mean, even my understanding of these lines, I tend to always think of it in the getting the Air Force closer to Japan, and I think of Iwo Jima and Peleliu and Tara in terms of beach landings and casualties. But of course, as you've explained today, these had their landings as well. They weren't as worst as some of the worst ones, but they were also had their the Banzai charges. There was loss of life, there was tragedies there, but somehow, when we do talk about them, it's very much of that the B-29 story.
Yeah. Well, how many times have you heard about the Battle of Tinian?
Yeah.
Anything that I've ever seen connected with Tinian is on the B-29s that took off from there. I mean, you're just talking to a monkey here. I don't recall ever seeing any documentaries or anything else that talks about, the guys who fought for that. And I think even in like Operation Forager and the Marianas campaign, you have the Pacific and everybody focuses on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, a little bit Guadalcanal maybe. If you dial down to the Marianas, most of the focus gets put on Saipan. And I think that's because that's where most of the killing and death takes place. Guam casualties are not as high. Tinian casualties are not as high. But that doesn't make them unimportant. There were people who died, taking those islands, and they were key to the Allied war effort. So I think they're worth talking about. And so Tinian is overshadowed by Saipan. 100%. That's 100% true. It's
because the world we live in, everything is kind of reduced to the greatest hits packages. So if you're doing even a 10-part series on the Pacific, well, there's going to be one episode on Pearl Harbor at least, one on the Japanese expansion, and then you've got to do one on Guadalcanal. You've got to do at least one on the atomic bomb, and you've got to do at least one on Iwo Jima. You're starting to run out of programs to fit these campaigns in. I mean, I was very proud recently to have Reg Newell on from New Zealand talking about the Treasury Islands, which are A, islands I'd never really heard of, and B, I certainly didn't know about the New Zealand troops landing there. And again, he was pains to point out it wasn't thousands of New Zealanders killed there, it was dozens and hundreds, but it was still part of this campaign. It was all part of this getting the Allied army closer to Japan to bring an end to the war. And you can't, just because some have more significance than others doesn't mean the ones with less significance aren't still interesting and worth talking about. And again, the whole the bringing of water. I mean, there's thousands of descendants of veterans maybe watching this and watching your content whose granddad or great uncle or grandmother was just simply involved in transporting stuff and never saw an enemy soldier, never saw an enemy carrier, but was just daily involved in shipping. Mr. Roberts, the famous film from the play with Henry Fonda, just boats just going back and forth across miles of blue ocean, just getting stuff to the front. And that's a story in itself.
Well, there's another element in all of this, and in that I'm kind of like you in a way, in that I can be a little bit contrarian, where, there's these things that people know, and I'm like, okay, here's what you know. Let me show. Here's what you maybe didn't know. I mean, whenever you and I were in Normandy, one of the things that I loved about hanging out with you is you would say, well, here, just give me 15 minutes. Here, let me show you something real quick. Kind of showing people. Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm wanting to do, especially with Tinian, and maybe some of the stuff with Saipan. There's some of the stuff with Saipan. I'm hitting, the things that people have heard about, maybe showing it from a different angle. But really with the channel in general, I want to show you the things that you've heard about and that while I'm doing that, I want to show you, hey, maybe here's a few things that you didn't know about and that I didn't know about, and that we're all learning together.
Familiar with a few different twists to it, isn't it? There's a familiarity about it. You've kind of seen some of this before, but here's the twist I've given to it to just make it a little bit of a different slant. So when can we when is the series going to launch?
Sunday.
Yep. Well,
just
then. So there we are, folks. Well,
just finishing up with some stuff at Pearl Harbor and
to publicize JD's History Underground channel. But if you haven't found it yet, obviously there's nobody here who hasn't found it. That's a good diving in point. And then there's the Normandy, and we can go back to Gettysburg. So, well, JD, it's been great talking to you. We ought to bring things in, but just to come in under 2 hours. I've got another show starting.
Before we go, I do want to add one thing. Hey, I do want to thank you for this channel. This has been such a valuable resource for me, and you were doing things on this channel that nobody else is doing, and I hope people appreciate the hard work. I could not do what you do because I just don't have the depth of knowledge or anything like that to be able to talk to all these people and bring us together.
Bring it all, and my trick is doing everything live. You remove the editing process, and then when I end stream in a minute's time, that's it. I can go and have a drink and sit on the and anyway, but it's absolutely great talking to you, and I hope we continue our collaboration both virtually and in person. And who knows, maybe we'll end up visiting the Eastern Front or something together. And who knows?
One of these days we need to get together and show people that the Battle of Normandy took place further than 500 yards from the beach.
Yeah, it took place without the beach being in view. Yeah, no, it's I've got some TV work coming up with some stuff, some various projects, and of course, they want to go near the beaches, and I'm trying to kind of go away from the beaches, and we'll end up finding that compromise where, but it's there's much more stuff to do, but we're rambling now. So, folks, brilliant. Thank you for watching, everybody. Soul David is on later on, 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, talking about Devil Dogs. And it's not going to be a complete presentation about the finished book, which is he's got the advanced copies of. It's more about the research process. It's like with JD, how he learned about the terrain, how he chose a particular unit to write about, and that kind of putting a book together process. So Soul is great fun. So we're doing that later. So JD, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you all again soon, folks. So it's Paul Woodadge from WW2TV saying cheers, and I will see you all again in 3 hours' time. Cheers. Bye.